In architectural terms, rooms partially or completely below ground with windows are known as semi-basements and were primarily used as servant accommodation in domestic settings or were used as workrooms in businesses and government buildings. Semi-basements were designed to support human life and activity, and so they had windows. By contrast, basements and cellars were usually completely sealed-in rooms and often a little deeper, designed for produce storage, valuables, etc. However, there is a very small group of people who subscribe to the mudflood hypothesis, which is the belief that our modern towns and cities were at some point in the past engulfed by a global mudflood event, and they cite as evidence the many buildings around the world, especially in Western nations, that show rooms at or just below ground level. The thinking behind this is that these below ground rooms were actually once originally at ground level, and it was the mudflood that buried them and raised the level of the overall surrounding landscape. At some point soon after, these partially buried buildings were then dug out, resulting in these rooms now being partially trapped below street level. No exact date has been agreed upon for this supposed mudflood, and new dates keep popping up all the time. However, the mid-19th century seems to be the favoured choice. The desire and need to incorporate semi-basements is ultimately tied to economics. In the post-Roman and medieval periods, houses were much simpler constructions, mostly built of wood, thatch, and wattle and daub. But as Western nations expanded their influence and trade across the world in the late medieval period and into the early modern period, some people, now flush with wealth, began building larger, more ornate private homes that required servants' quarters. And it was often in the countryside, not in the cities, that large grandiose homes began to incorporate below ground level accommodation. Coles Hill House, built around 1660, Clarendon House in London, completed in 1667, Chatsworth House, circa 1565, remodelled and completed in 1707. These country manor houses needed considerable numbers of staff, and so these people were often housed either beneath the manor or else in a side or separate wing on ground level, in addition to all the goods, equipment, clothing, etc. that had to be stored. And all of these stately homes predate the mudflood, yet they have windows partially below ground. As the Western nations became more wealthy through international trade, empires, and significantly via the Industrial Revolution, the wealthy, now often living in the larger cities, wished to house within their own new multi-storey homes a growing population of domestic servants. The design concept of below-ground rooms from country homes was brought to the rapidly expanding cities. Hence, new homes for the wealthy took advantage of their limited block sizes and were built with servants' quarters incorporated into the design, but hidden away partially below ground level. Why have only 2, 3, or 4 floors when you can have an extra one, tucked away for the servants and mostly out of sight for visiting wealthy friends? Labour during these times was cheap, and so sometimes multiple servants could be employed, and these might include cooks, nannies, caretakers, butlers, valets, and laundresses. The British census of 1891 showed that there were 1.3 million girls and women working as domestic servants in the UK, and by the start of the 20th century, domestic service was the single largest occupation in Britain. Where were these young ladies accommodated? Often in purpose-built semi-basement accommodation. But the majority of homes with semi-basements were terraced houses, maybe only employing 1 or 2 people, or sometimes none at all. These styles of homes are prevalent across many parts of London and other British cities today, and they fetch high prices. As these styles of architecture flourished in Britain and Western Europe, so too were they transplanted to the lands being colonised by Europeans. That's why we see such designs, often built during the 19th century, in places like North America and Australia. People wanted to emulate the architecture of the places they had left. They wanted to carry on the styles and trends that were fashionable in their home countries. And it wasn't just homes that were built with semi-basement facilities. Often government buildings and office buildings were constructed to include a semi-basement. These were often used for storage of goods, but which still required people to interact with them: printing presses, machinery, heavy goods storage, inventory, and so on. When the economic need for partially below-ground accommodation dried up, the style went out of fashion. That's why you don't find semi-basement servant accommodation being built after World War I. There just wasn't the economic need anymore. It was also at this time that public transport became more widespread, and this greatly reduced the need to house servants within wealthy homes. People could now commute. Even today, some modern homes incorporate a semi-basement into the design, simply because it works. It provides an extra storage space or guest bedrooms, and is easy to incorporate into the overall house plan. Mudflood leaves a great many unanswered questions. For example, in London today, there are a number of medieval buildings still standing, all having survived the Great Fire of London of 1666 and the Luftwaffe bombings of World War II, and none of these show signs of being affected by a mudflood. For example, St Olave's Church, circa 1450, the Old Curiosity Shop, 1567, Prince Henry's Room, 1610, the Old Wine Shades, 1663, the Seven Stars, 1680s, Hoop and Grapes, circa 1690. None of these buildings are partially buried. It therefore begs the question, why did the mud flood not affect these late medieval buildings? Why did the mud only target the more elaborate homes and structures? Was the mud choosy about what it decided to swirl around and partially bury? Taking all this into account, why isn't Westminster Abbey, built in 1065 and rebuilt in the Gothic style in the 13th century, partially buried below ground as a result of the mud flood? By the way, its actual name is the Collegiate Church of St Peter at Westminster. I ask this question because Westminster Abbey sits on lower ground than areas such as Holborn, Bloomsbury, St John's Wood and Mayfair, which are to the north. And all of these northern areas have many buildings that feature partially below ground windows and rooms. So the question is, wouldn't a mud flood flow downwards? Why would the mud envelop buildings on higher ground, like at St John's Wood, and yet leave buildings unaffected on much lower ground, like Westminster Abbey? If you take a look at Google Earth Street View, you can see a multi-storey building with windows partially below ground level, and mudflood proponents might label this as a mudflood building. Yet if you pan right, you can see Westminster Abbey standing at ground level. It is clear that the later smaller building, when constructed, was deliberately dug down below the natural ground surface as part of its design and construction. Architectural, economic, photographic and topographic evidence clearly shows that this hypothetical mudflood plays no role whatsoever in the design history of homes and buildings.